Back during the Black Death, nobody knew why everybody was dying. Of course, today we know it's because of the fleas that were on the rats. But back then, it was way before anybody could understand science. Way back before we humans learned how to use science to increase health and improve the quality of life. But there was this one guy that was trying to figure this out. The guy that wanted to understand this. So he started doing what any regular scientist would do. He wanted to look objectively at the data. The first thing he did was to see if he could find any differences between the people that were dying of the plague and the people that weren't. So he went around and carefully put marks on people's houses who had the plague. Once he had categorized people who had the Black Death and those that didn't, he planned to come back around and try to collect more data. There's an idea in evolution called an evolutionary bottleneck. It's when most of any species dies and there's only a small percentage left over. It's called a bottleneck because whoever is left over will create all the subsequent generations of that particular species. One very famous case of this was in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. There were these white moths. Most were white, but a small percentage were black. The black ones were easy to see, so they were eaten by predators, birds. But then the Industrial Revolution happened, and all the sides of the buildings in London were covered in black soot. So the black moths suddenly had an evolutionary advantage. All the white ones got eaten, and in only a couple of moth generations, they all turned from white to black. There was a guy named Malthus who was famous back in the day for predicting that we were all about to die. He had a theory that's now referred to as the Malthusian trap. If you look back into history, you can see these cycles they call Malthusian cycles. When the population increases, reaches a tipping point where the number of people exceed the carrying capacity, and then a lot of people die. Most people incorrectly believe that with the Industrial Revolution, we finally broke out of the Malthusian trap. But when you look at the actual equation that Malthus came up with, it still holds true today. If you were to study English literature, you would no doubt study Shakespeare. Most people, when we think about Shakespeare, we tend to think of very intelligently written, highly articulate art forms that is normally associated with highbrow type people. But if you were to go back in time and watch some Shakespearean plays performed while he was still alive, you would have a very, very different perspective. One of the reasons, according to economist Dr. Gregory Clark, that the Industrial Revolution happened in England and not in Japan was because back then the English were filthy people. Because they were filthy people, they had a higher death rate, which gave them a higher GDP per person or a higher amount of wealth per person. This extra wealth per person gave them the wherewithal, at least the people that didn't die from living in their own filth, to save money. This is one variable out of many that tilted the Industrial Revolution in England's favor. The Japanese, on the other hand, were very, very clean. Because the Japanese people were clean and the English people were filthy, the population of Tokyo was much higher than the population of London. And since the population of Tokyo was much higher, they had much less wealth per person. One example that Dr. Clark gives of how filthy the pre-industrial English were was the Globe Theatre, the place where all the Shakespearean plays were first performed. It's not like in the Academy Award-winning movie Shakespeare in Love. In real life, the Globe Theatre didn't have any public toilets. People would just relieve themselves inside wherever they felt like. Often, while the play was being performed, people would be watching a Shakespearean play, go off to the side, take a dump right there, and then pull their pants back up without even using any toilet paper. The English back then were very much like Critical Bill from the movie Things to Do in Denver When You're Dead. Malthus postulated that every population of animals, including humans, is bound by only 4 variables: death rate, birth rate, food per person, and population number. If any one changes, the rest will change accordingly. The only thing that changed with the Industrial Revolution was that they figured out how to use fossil fuels, particularly in the Haber process, a way to get more food out of the ground. But in Malthus's equation, you can easily substitute energy per person instead of food per person, since food is energy as it is measured in calories, which is a unit of energy. The number of people on planet Earth is much larger today than in Malthus's time, but that's only because we have much more energy available per person than in Malthus's time. But if the energy per person ever goes below a certain number required to sustain 7 to 8 billion people, there will be a major die-off. And if you ask any scientist, regardless of their political orientation, they all agree that our access to fossil fuels will come to an end. And fossil fuels or not, renewable energy or not, if the number of people are ever greater than the minimum amount of energy per person, it will become cannibal planet. Another reason for the Industrial Revolution happening in England, or more broadly Europe, was because of the Black Death. Before the Black Death, wages were slowly falling, but after the Black Death, when the population of Europe had been reduced by a third, wages went up, giving people the ability to save money. Sometimes evolutionary bottlenecks don't have to be quick or drastic. This is one reason why Europeans brought diseases with them to the New World, diseases that killed a lot of people. Throughout the Middle Ages and even before, Europeans had gone through plenty of bottlenecks where people without resistance to diseases were slowly weeded out of the gene pool, and the only people who lived were naturally resistant. When people saw this guy going around to houses and putting marks on the doors, they didn't know what he was doing. Then somebody realized that all the houses this guy was putting marks on were people that had the Black Death. They assumed the marks he was putting on the houses were some kind of curse that was causing the Black Death, and they killed this guy. It's very tough being a scientist in a world of death and black magic.